Welcome to our insightful and impressive story today. Millionaire kicks beautiful maid for stealing money. But what she says shocked him and knees. In this riveting tale of wealth, deception, and unexpected revelation, a millionaire finds himself in a situation that challenges his perspectives. The story unfolds in a lavish mansion where opulence is a way of life, but not all that glitters is gold. The millionaire, accustomed to the comforts of his affluent lifestyle, is suddenly faced with a disturbing accusation against one of his trusted maids. Inform us if you are enthusiastic about this narrative. If you are, press 1 if you found the video to be enjoyable. If this is not the case, press 0. Your comments are a great source of motivation for me to collect more stories that are uplifting and meaningful.
Lily's days always started before the sun rose. The quiet hum of the city waking up was her alarm clock. As the streets of New York slowly began to fill with life, she was already heading to the mansion where she worked. Her life had been a delicate balance of responsibility and survival, split between caring for her sick mother, Claire, and working long hours as a housekeeper for the wealthy Parker family. The mansion of Richard and Veronica Parker stood out in its neighborhood, an architectural masterpiece, all sharp edges and gleaming glass, the kind of place that made people stop and stare. For Lily, however, it was simply a reminder of the divide between her world and theirs. Inside those opulent walls, she scrubbed floors, polished furniture, and maintained an air of invisibility. That was her role, after all, to be unseen, to blend into the background, just another fixture in the Parkers' luxurious life. Veronica Parker was the kind of woman who made sure everyone knew who held the power in the household. She would glide through the mansion like a queen, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors, her eyes cold and calculating. Though she rarely spoke directly to Lily, her presence was felt in every room. Veronica's sharp commands would be delivered through whispers to the head of staff, and everyone knew better than to cross her. But it was Richard Parker who intrigued Lily the most. He was distant, yes, but there was something else in his demeanor that caught her attention. He wasn't cruel like Veronica, but he wasn't kind either. He acknowledged her presence with curt nods, and every now and then, their eyes would meet across a room, as if he was trying to place her, trying to remember something long forgotten. She had always wondered why he treated her differently from the rest of the staff. It was as if there was a layer of respect there, though he never expressed it openly. Yet despite the occasional glance from Richard, Lily kept her distance. She couldn't afford to draw attention to herself, not when her main concern was her mother. Claire had fallen seriously ill a few years back, and the medical bills had been a constant drain on what little money Lily earned. Every penny she made at the Parker mansion went straight to Claire's care, doctors, medication, rent for their small apartment. There was no room for error. Losing her job would mean losing everything. On this particular morning, the air inside the mansion felt heavier than usual. The staff moved about quietly, eyes downcast, as if trying to avoid attracting attention. Something was wrong, but Lily couldn't place what it was. The tension was palpable, and it wasn't long before she realized why. Veronica had lost something valuable. She overheard the whispers in the kitchen while wiping down the dining room table. Did you hear about the necklace?" one of the maids muttered. "The diamond one?" another replied, her voice hushed. "Yeah, gone. Mrs. Parker is furious." Lily's heart sank. She had seen that necklace before. It was Veronica's prized possession, often flaunted at events or during meetings with Richard's business associates. A piece so expensive, it could probably pay for her mother's treatment for years. Losing it was no small matter. And if Veronica was on the warpath, it was only a matter of time before someone would be blamed. By the time Lily made her way upstairs to continue her duties, she could hear Veronica's raised voice echoing through the halls. The staff avoided her as much as possible, ducking into side rooms or pretending to be busier than usual. "How could this happen?" Veronica's voice was sharp, slicing through the silence. "This is unacceptable. I want answers." Lily's pulse quickened. She had heard that tone before. It meant trouble was coming, and she didn't want to be anywhere near it. But before she could slip away, Veronica stormed into the room where she was cleaning. Her gaze landed directly on Lily. "You!" Veronica snapped, her eyes narrowing with accusation. "Where were you this morning?" Lily stood frozen, her cleaning rag still in hand, her mind racing. I was downstairs," she stammered. "I haven't touched anything, Mrs. Parker, I swear." Veronica stepped closer, her cold eyes boring into Lily. "We'll see about that," she hissed before turning on her heel and marching out of the room. Lily's hands trembled as she resumed her work. Something told her this wasn't going to end well. The tension in the Parker mansion only grew worse as the day dragged on. Lily could feel the weight of Veronica's suspicion hanging over her like a dark cloud. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the icy accusation in Veronica's eyes. The entire household seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. It wasn't long before it did. Later that afternoon, as Lily was folding linens in the laundry room, the door swung open with a force that startled her. Veronica stormed in, her face twisted with anger, and right behind her was Richard, looking troubled but silent. A few of the other staff members lingered in the hallway, their eyes wide with concern. Veronica wasted no time. She pointed an accusing finger at Lily, her voice rising as she addressed the gathered crowd. "This woman," she spat, "has stolen from me. The diamond necklace, the one Richard gave me for our anniversary, is gone, and she—" Veronica jabbed her finger again in Lily's direction. "Is the thief." The words hit Lily like a physical blow. She stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Her stomach churned, and her legs felt weak beneath her. "I didn't—" she started, but Veronica cut her off. "Don't you dare lie to me." Veronica's voice echoed off the walls, sharp and venomous. "We all know it was you. You're the only one who had access to my dressing room this morning. You've always been ungrateful for the chance to work here, and now you've shown your true colors." Lily's mind raced. She hadn't been anywhere near Veronica's dressing room. She had spent the morning cleaning the downstairs rooms and hadn't even set foot on the upper floors until much later. But it didn't matter. She could see in Veronica's face that her mind was made up. Richard finally spoke, his voice softer but firm. "Veronica, maybe we should—" "No!" Veronica snapped, turning to face her husband. "She needs to be fired. Now! I won't have a thief in my house." Lily felt the floor drop out from under her. Fired. This couldn't be happening. Losing this job would mean losing everything. Her mother's care, their rent, the fragile balance of their lives. Everything depended on her income from the Parkers. She turned to Richard, desperation in her eyes. "Mr. Parker, please. I didn't do this. I would never steal from anyone. You have to believe me." Richard met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something. Doubt. Sympathy? She couldn't tell. But it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. He looked away, rubbing his temple as if he could erase the entire situation with a simple gesture. "I think—" Richard hesitated, glancing between his wife and Lily. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I think it's best if we handle this quietly. Let's not make it a public spectacle." But Veronica wasn't interested in discretion. She wanted justice, or at least her version of it. "Quietly?" she scoffed. "This is my house, and I won't be humiliated by some lowly maid who thinks she can steal from me. She needs to be out. Today." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She had to defend herself, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She looked around the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in. But the other staff members kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. They knew better than to challenge Veronica. "I swear to you, I didn't do this," Lily managed to say, her voice trembling. "I've always done my best here. I would never—" But her words were drowned out by Veronica's rage. "Enough!" she shouted. "Pack your things and get out. I don't want to see your face in this house again." Lily's hands trembled as she took a step back, her mind spinning. Fired. Just like that, her world was crumbling around her. She opened her mouth to protest one last time, But before she could speak, Richard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Go," he said quietly, avoiding her eyes. "It's for the best." And that was it, the final blow. Lily felt a coldness wash over her as the reality sank in. Her job, her livelihood, the one thing that had kept her and her mother afloat, it was gone. Just like that, erased by a single accusation. She turned and walked out of the laundry room, her legs shaky, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of them. As she climbed the stairs to gather her things, she heard Veronica's voice behind her. Quieter now, but still dripping with venom. "You're lucky I'm not calling the police." Lily didn't respond. What was the point? She knew she was innocent, but in Veronica's world, innocence didn't matter. All that mattered was power, and Veronica held all of it. In her room, Lily packed her few belongings into a small, worn bag. As she zipped it up, her mind raced. What was she going to tell her mother? How could she explain this without worrying her even more? They barely had enough to survive as it was. What would they do now? But even as the weight of her situation pressed down on her, something deeper stirred inside her. An old memory, a half-forgotten story her mother had once told her. A secret that might change everything. Lily wiped her eyes and stood up. She wasn't done yet. Lily descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The mansion that had once been her place of work now felt hostile, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. She passed by the other staff, who offered her little more than sympathetic glances, but none dared speak up. Everyone knew better than to challenge Veronica Parker's decisions, especially after such a public display. Her small bag weighed on her shoulder, but the weight in her chest was far greater. The thought of returning to her sick mother, explaining why she'd lost the job, filled her with dread. Claire's condition was worsening by the day, and without Lily's steady income, they were on the brink of losing everything. How could she possibly face her now? Lily's mind churned with unanswered questions. Why had this happened? Why had Veronica been so quick to accuse her, with no evidence other than her presence in the house? And why had Richard, who always seemed a little kinder, a little more understanding, allowed it to happen? As she reached the front door, her hand paused on the doorknob. This was it. The end of everything she had worked so hard to maintain. And yet, something inside her refused to let go without a fight. The memory that had stirred earlier was now clearer, and it gave her just enough courage to turn back. With shaky steps, Lily walked down the long hallway that led to Richard's study. She didn't knock, just opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Richard sat at his desk, staring down at a piece of paper with a furrowed brow. When he noticed her standing there, he looked up, surprised but not angry. "Lily," he said quietly, as if expecting this moment. "I thought you'd left." Lily's throat was dry, but she forced the words out. "Mr. Parker, I didn't steal that necklace. I swear on my life I didn't. But there's something else you need to know. Something I didn't want to say before. But now, I have no choice." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go on." Lily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't intended to reveal this in such a rushed, desperate moment, but there was no turning back now. "My mother, Claire, she always told me that, before I was born, she had a relationship with a man. A man who left her before he ever knew she was pregnant. She never wanted me to find him, said it was better this way, but she always said his name." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. "His name," Lily continued, her voice trembling, "was Richard. Richard Parker." The room went still. Richard stared at her, unblinking, his face pale. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Lily's heart sank as she feared she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe he wouldn't remember. Maybe it was all some wild coincidence. Maybe, Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Claire." The way he said her mother's name, soft and full of emotion, told Lily everything she needed to know. He remembered. "I loved her," he murmured, almost to himself. "It was so long ago. I didn't know. I never knew." Lily reached into her bag, her hands trembling, and pulled out the letter. The letter her mother had kept all these years, yellowed and fragile from time, but still legible. She placed it on his desk, watching as Richard slowly picked it up, his eyes scanning the faded ink. "I don't know why she never told you," Lily said quietly. "But this is the proof." Richard read the letter in silence, his expression shifting from shock to something deeper. Regret, perhaps. Lily couldn't be sure. When he finally set the letter down, he looked at her, his eyes full of a sadness she hadn't expected. "I should have known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I was young and foolish, and when her family separated us, I thought it was over. I didn't know she was pregnant." Lily's heart ached. This wasn't how she had wanted to tell him, but now that the truth was out, there was no going back. She stood there, unsure of what to say next, unsure of how Richard would respond. "I'm sorry," Richard said, standing up and walking toward her. I don't know what to say. All this time, you're my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lily felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't cry. She had spent too many years learning how to hold back her tears. "I didn't know either, not until recently," Lily admitted. "My mother didn't want to tell me. But after everything that's happened, I couldn't keep it a secret any longer." Richard seemed at a loss for words. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to process this revelation. "This changes everything," he said softly, almost to himself. "I need to think. I need time." Lily nodded, understanding the weight of what she had just told him. "I didn't come here expecting anything from you, Mr. Parker. I just thought you deserved to know the truth. That's all." Before Richard could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door, and Veronica stormed in, her face flushed with anger. She hadn't expected to see Lily there, but when she did, her eyes flashed with fury. "What is she still doing here?" Veronica demanded. "I told you to get rid of her." Richard glanced at Lily, then back at Veronica. For the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "We need to talk," he said firmly, "about everything." The air in the room grew thicker as Veronica stood there, her eyes darting between Richard and Lily, trying to make sense of the tension. Richard, for the first time in what felt like years, looked at her with a determination she hadn't seen before. Lily remained quiet, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that what came next would change everything. "What are you talking about?" Veronica demanded, her voice sharp. "What could possibly be left to discuss? I want her out of this house, Richard." Richard took a deep breath, his gaze lingering on Veronica for a moment before turning back to Lily. "There's something you don't know," he said, his tone firm but measured. "Something I just learned myself." Veronica's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" Lily could see the uncertainty in Richard's eyes as he searched for the right words. It wasn't easy to admit what had just been revealed, but it had to be done. He walked around his desk, moving closer to Veronica, who stood with her arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. "Lily isn't just one of the housekeepers here," Richard began, his voice steady despite the storm that was about to hit. She's my daughter." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Veronica's face contorted in disbelief, a mixture of shock and anger flickering in her eyes. She took a step back as if the very idea of what Richard had just said was physically pushing her away. "What?" Veronica's voice came out in a harsh whisper, her lips barely moving. "What did you just say?" Richard glanced at Lily, who stood frozen by the doorway, and then back at Veronica. "It's true," Claire, Lily's mother, was someone I was involved with many years ago, before we met. We were separated before I ever knew she was pregnant. And now, I've learned that Lily is my daughter. Veronica's shock quickly morphed into fury. She let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head as if trying to shake off the absurdity of what she had just heard. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "How can you possibly believe this? She's lying, Richard. She's trying to manipulate you." Lily's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Veronica's voice dripped with venom, her accusations hanging heavy in the air. "I'm not lying," Lily said quietly, stepping forward. She pulled the letter out from her bag again, holding it out toward Veronica. "This is a letter my mother kept for years. It's from Richard. It proves everything." Veronica snatched the letter from Lily's hand and glanced at it, her eyes scanning the faded ink. Her expression grew more unreadable by the second. When she finished, she tossed the letter onto the desk as if it were nothing more than a piece of trash. "This proves nothing," she said coldly. "This could be forged for all we know. You're just some desperate girl trying to get a piece of our life." Lily bit her lip, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had expected resistance, but Veronica's words still cut deep. She turned to Richard, hoping he would step in, and he did. "Enough, Veronica," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I know it's hard to believe, but I don't need more proof. I remember Claire, and I remember everything that happened between us." "This isn't some scheme. Lily is telling the truth." Veronica's eyes blazed with fury. "So you're just going to accept this? You're going to let her manipulate you into believing she's your daughter? Just like that?" Richard stood his ground, his expression resolute. "This isn't up for debate. The truth is the truth, whether you like it or not." For a moment, Veronica said nothing. The air between them crackled with tension as the weight of Richard's words sank in. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the door, pausing just long enough to deliver one last bitter parting shot. "If you want to throw away everything we've built because of this fantasy, then go ahead," Veronica hissed, "but don't expect me to stand by and watch." With that, she disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the mansion. The room fell into a heavy silence once again, and Lily felt the weight of everything that had just transpired pressing down on her. She didn't know whether to feel relief or guilt, but either way, nothing would be the same after today. Richard let out a long, tired sigh and turned toward Lily. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer now. "I know this has been a lot, but I want you to know that I'm going to do what I can to make this right. I should have known sooner, and I should have been there for you." Lily swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. She had dreamed of meeting her father for so long, but never like this. "I didn't come here to make things harder for you," she said quietly. "I just thought you deserved to know." Richard nodded, his expression full of regret. "I appreciate that. And now that I do know, we can't just leave things as they are. I want to help you. I want to be a part of your life, Lily, if you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the father she had always wondered about, the man who had been missing from her life but who now seemed willing to make amends. Before Lily could respond, a soft knock came at the door, and one of the house staff entered cautiously. "Mr. Parker," the maid said, her voice hesitant. "Mrs. Parker has requested that her things be packed. She's leaving." Richard glanced at Lily, a heavy sigh escaping him. "It seems things are changing faster than we thought." Lily wasn't sure what to say. The weight of the truth hung between them, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt uncertain. But one thing was clear. Her life, and Richard's, would never be the same. The echo of Veronica's footsteps lingered in the halls long after she left, but the silence that followed was almost louder. Richard stood by the window of his study, staring out at the sprawling garden he had once taken so much pride in. Now, it all felt hollow. The manicured hedges, the pristine lawns, none of it mattered anymore. His mind was consumed by the weight of everything Lily had just revealed. Lily sat quietly in the corner of the room, unsure of what to say or do. She had been prepared for Veronica's fury, but the tension between her and Richard was harder to navigate. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake by revealing the truth. But deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Still, the look on Richard's face, the mixture of shock, regret, and something else she couldn't quite place, made her heart ache. Richard turned from the window and walked slowly back to his desk, his steps heavy with the weight of the years that had passed without him knowing the truth. He sat down, running a hand through his graying hair, and let out a long sigh. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. "Claire," he said quietly, almost to himself, "I loved her. I really did." Lily didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. Hearing him speak her mother's name with such tenderness was strange. Claire had always been a quiet, reserved woman, rarely speaking of the past. When she had told Lily about Richard, it had been with a mix of sadness and finality, as if she had already accepted that part of her life was over. Richard looked up at Lily, his eyes searching her face for something. Maybe a glimpse of Claire, maybe a sense of understanding. "I never knew," he said softly. "I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had known..." He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air between them. Lily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had always imagined what it would be like to meet her father, but she had never expected it to be like this, so full of regret, so complicated. "I understand," Lily finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't blame you. I thought you should know." Richard nodded slowly, but the guilt in his eyes remained. "I wish I had known sooner," he said. "I would have done things differently. I would have been there for you and your mother." Lily appreciated his words, but they didn't change the reality of the situation. The years that had passed, the years without him, could never be erased. Still, there was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her now, that made her believe he was sincere. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," Lily said softly. "I just thought you deserved to know the truth. That's all." Richard shook his head, leaning forward on his desk as if the weight of his thoughts was too much to bear. "No, Lily, you deserve more than that. I should have been there for you. For Claire!" His voice cracked slightly as he said her name, and he quickly cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. Lily shifted in her seat. She had spent years imagining what it would be like to confront her father, but now that it was happening, the reality was far more complicated than she had anticipated. She could see the regret in Richard's eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was enough to bridge the gap between them. Too much time had passed. Too much had been left unsaid. Richard seemed to sense her hesitation. He stood up and walked over to where she sat, lowering himself to her level so that their eyes met. "Lily," he said softly, "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I want to help you. You and your mother. Please, let me do that." Lily felt a lump in her throat as she considered his words. The offer was tempting, especially given the dire situation with her mother's health. But something inside her resisted. Could she trust him? Could she accept his help after all these years of silence? Before she could respond, Richard continued, "I owe it to you. I owe it to Claire. I can't undo the mistakes I've made, but I can try to make up for them now. Please, let me help." Lily looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had never expected this kind of offer, and part of her wanted to say yes, to accept the help she so desperately needed. But another part of her was wary. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially after everything she had been through. "I don't know," Lily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you, not after everything." Richard nodded, his expression somber. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I don't blame you for feeling that way, but I want to earn your trust, Lily. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even denial, but not this. Not this openness, this vulnerability. It was clear that Richard was trying to make amends, but whether or not she could accept that was a question she wasn't ready to answer just yet. "I need time," Lily said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need to think about it." Richard nodded again, standing up slowly. "Take all the time you need," he said gently. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready." Lily stood as well, clutching her bag tightly to her side. The conversation had been far more emotional than she had anticipated, and she wasn't sure how to process everything that had just happened. All she knew was that her life had changed in a way she could never have predicted. As she made her way toward the door, Richard's voice stopped her one last time. "Lily," he called softly, and she turned to face him. "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, filled with years of regret and missed opportunities. Lily nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and then she left the room, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Parker mansion was tense. Lily had returned home after her conversation with Richard, but sleep had eluded her. She spent the night tossing and turning, trying to process everything. Her father, Richard Parker, wanted to be a part of her life. The man she had unknowingly worked for all these years was now offering to help her and her sick mother. It was too much to take in at once. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Lily made her way back to the mansion, her mind heavy with uncertainty. She wasn't sure what her next move would be, but she needed to speak with Richard again. There were too many loose ends, too many questions that needed answers. When she arrived, the house felt quieter than usual. The staff went about their duties with a nervous energy, as if they sensed that something was brewing beneath the surface. Lily made her way to the study, hoping to find Richard alone. But as she reached the door, she heard voices inside, voices that were growing louder by the second. "I will not be humiliated like this," Veronica's voice rang out, sharp and filled with venom. "Do you understand, Richard? This is my house, my life, and I will not let some girl, some maid, come in here and tear it apart." Lily's heart raced as she pressed her ear against the door. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but she couldn't stop herself. She needed to hear what was being said. "I'm not asking for your permission," Richard's voice replied, calm but firm. "This isn't about you, Veronica. It's about the truth. Lily is my daughter, and I won't turn my back on her." There was a brief, stunned silence before Veronica spoke again, her voice trembling with rage. "How can you say that? You don't even know her. She's probably lying, trying to take advantage of you, of us. Can't you see that?" Richard's tone hardened. "She's not lying. I knew her mother, Veronica. I loved her mother. And if I had known about Lily all those years ago, things would have been different." The words hit Lily like a punch to the gut. Richard had loved her mother. It was something Claire had never spoken about in detail, always keeping the past buried deep. But hearing Richard admit it now made everything feel more real. Veronica let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, don't try to romanticize the past, Richard. That was a lifetime ago. And now you want to drag all of that back into our lives? What about us? What about everything we've built together?" Richard's voice softened slightly, but there was still an edge to it. "Veronica, I'm not asking you to like this, but I can't ignore it anymore. Lily is my daughter, and I have a responsibility to her." Lily couldn't take it anymore. She pushed open the door, stepping into the room. Both Richard and Veronica turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of surprise and tension. Veronica's eyes narrowed as she took in Lily's presence, her lips curling into a sneer. "What are you doing here?" Veronica snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "Haven't you caused enough damage already?" Lily's hands trembled, but she stood her ground. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I just came to talk to Richard." Veronica's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to call him that. He's my husband, and this is my house. You don't belong here." "Veronica," Richard interjected, his tone a warning. "That's enough." But Veronica wasn't done. She stepped closer to Lily, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can just waltz in here, claim you're his daughter, and everything will magically change? You're nobody. You're nothing. You were hired to clean this house, not tear apart our family." Lily's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted the truth. I didn't even know who my father was until recently." Veronica let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "The truth? You don't care about the truth. You care about money. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You see an opportunity to cash in, and you're taking it." Lily felt the sting of Veronica's words, but before she could respond, Richard stepped in between them, his voice cold and steady. "Stop it, Veronica. This isn't about money. Lily isn't here for any of that. She's here because she deserves to know the truth, just like I do." Veronica's face twisted in disgust. "And what about me, Richard? Don't I deserve something here? I've been your wife for years. I've stood by your side, and now you're throwing it all away for her." Richard turned to face his wife, his expression full of regret but firm in his resolve. "I'm not throwing anything away, but I can't ignore what's right in front of me. Lily is my daughter, and that changes things." The room fell into a tense silence. Veronica's hands balled into fists at her sides, her face red with anger. She opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it, as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice cold and calculated. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "And when this all blows up in your face, don't come crying to me." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the mansion, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Lily stood there, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She hadn't expected Veronica to lash out like that, but part of her wasn't surprised. Veronica was desperate to hold on to her life, her status, and Lily was a threat to all of that. Richard let out a long breath, rubbing his temples as if trying to push away the headache that was surely forming. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice tired. "Veronica, she's not handling this well." Lily shook her head. "It's not your fault. I know this is a lot. I didn't expect it to be easy." Richard looked at her, his eyes full of something that Lily couldn't quite place. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was regret, or maybe it was something more. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he admitted, "but I'm going to make sure you and your mother are taken care of. That's a promise." Lily nodded, grateful but unsure of what the future held. The truth was out now, but the fallout was just beginning. The following days at the Parker mansion felt like walking on eggshells. Veronica had retreated to her bedroom, barely speaking to anyone. She was like a storm waiting to erupt, and everyone in the household seemed to sense the tension. The staff moved around quietly, exchanging nervous glances but keeping their distance from both Veronica and Richard. Lily, on the other hand, had kept mostly to herself. She didn't know what to do next. Her relationship with Richard was still so new, and though he had promised to help her and her mother, she wasn't sure how to navigate this complicated web of emotions. Part of her wanted to leave the mansion and never look back, but another part of her knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. Then, one afternoon, as Lily was preparing to leave the mansion for the day, Richard called her into his study. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious. Lily nodded, stepping into the room. The last time they'd spoken here, so many things had changed. Now, she wasn't sure what else there was to reveal. Richard motioned for her to sit down. "I've been doing some thinking," he began, "about everything that's happened. And there's something I need to get to the bottom of." Lily's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward, his expression darkening. "The necklace. Veronica's necklace that went missing. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this than we know." Lily's heart sank. She hadn't thought much about the necklace since the day Veronica accused her of stealing it. In the whirlwind of revelations about her parentage, it had fallen to the back of her mind. But now, with Richard bringing it up again, the weight of that accusation returned in full force. "I swear, Mr. Parker," Lily said quickly, her voice firm. "I had nothing to do with that necklace. I don't know where it is, or why Veronica accused me." Richard held up a hand to stop her. "I believe you," he said, his tone reassuring. "I never thought you were involved in that. But Veronica's behavior lately, I've been thinking about it, and it doesn't make sense. She was so quick to blame you, so quick to make it public. And something about that doesn't sit right with me." Lily blinked, surprised. She had expected Richard to still be conflicted about the situation, but it seemed he had come to his own conclusions. "What are you saying?" she asked, a knot forming in her stomach. Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm saying that I don't think the necklace was stolen at all. I think Veronica hid it herself." Lily's eyes widened in shock. "Why would she do that?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "To get rid of you. From the moment she realized you were a threat to her status in this house, she wanted you gone. She must have seen you as a danger, someone who could unravel everything she's worked so hard to keep together." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "But why accuse me of stealing? Why not just fire me?" Richard's eyes darkened. "Because she knew that if she accused you of something as serious as theft, it would discredit you completely. Not just here, but everywhere. You'd never be able to find work in another household. She wanted to ruin you." Lily's hands trembled in her lap. She had always known Veronica didn't like her, but this level of cruelty was something she hadn't anticipated. Veronica hadn't just wanted her out of the house. She had wanted to destroy her entire future. "But why?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did I ever do to her?" Richard looked at her with a mixture of sadness and regret. "You didn't do anything. But the moment Veronica realized you were my daughter, whether she consciously admitted it or not, she saw you as a threat to everything she had built here." Lily stared at the floor, her mind racing. It all made sense now. The cold looks, the snide comments, the swift accusation. Veronica had known, on some level, that Lily was connected to Richard in a way that threatened her carefully constructed world. And instead of confronting that truth, she had tried to destroy Lily before anyone else could discover it. "What are you going to do?" Lily asked, looking up at Richard. Richard rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted by the situation. "I'm going to confront her. I can't let this go on. She needs to tell the truth, and she needs to take responsibility for what she's done." Lily nodded, though the idea of confronting Veronica made her stomach churn. She wasn't sure what to expect from the woman anymore. Veronica had always been calculating, but if she had gone so far as to frame Lily for theft, there was no telling what she might do next. Later that evening, Richard called Veronica into the study. Lily stayed outside, lingering in the hallway but close enough to hear the conversation. Her heart raced as she listened to their voices, tense and sharp. "I want the truth, Veronica," Richard said, his voice stern. "I know you hid the necklace. I know you accused Lily of stealing it to get rid of her." There was a pause, and then Veronica's voice, cold and defensive. "You're being ridiculous. I did no such thing." "You can stop lying," Richard snapped. "I'm not going to let this go. You owe Lily an apology, and you owe me the truth." Another silence. Lily could imagine the look on Veronica's face, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes narrowing with disdain. But then, to Lily's surprise, Veronica spoke again, her voice low and bitter. "So what if I did?" she hissed. "What difference does it make? You've already chosen her over me." Richard's voice softened, but it was clear he wasn't going to back down. "This isn't about choosing sides. It's about doing what's right. You tried to destroy her life for your own selfish reasons, and that's something I can't forgive." There was another pause, and then Veronica's voice, softer now but still filled with venom. "You've ruined everything, Richard. Everything." With that, the door to the study swung open, and Veronica stormed out, her face flushed with anger. She didn't even glance at Lily as she passed, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors. Lily watched her go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. Richard stepped out of the study, his face tired but resolute. "It's over," he said quietly. She admitted it. Lily nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. The truth was out, but the damage had been done, and now they would have to pick up the pieces. Veronica's departure from the study left a void in the mansion. The sharp clack of her heels as she stormed down the hallway echoed long after she was gone. For the first time, Lily felt like the house was truly hers and Richard's, no longer overshadowed by the overbearing presence of Veronica. But with that came the reality that nothing would be the same. Lily stood in the hallway, watching Richard's face as he processed everything. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. His broad shoulders sagged slightly as if the weight of all the years of deception and miscommunication had finally caught up to him. "She's leaving," Richard said after a long pause, his voice heavy. "She'll pack her things and be gone by morning." Lily wasn't sure how to feel. The woman who had tormented her, framed her, and tried to ruin her life was finally being removed from the mansion. But it didn't feel like a victory. Instead, it felt like a quiet, bitter end to a long, painful chapter in both of their lives. Richard turned to her, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice filled with regret. "I should have seen this coming. I should have protected you from her." Lily shook her head, trying to ease his guilt. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You couldn't have known." Richard let out a deep sigh and walked past her, moving toward the living room. "Even so," he murmured, "I've let too many things slide over the years. I should have done better, been better. For you, for your mother, for everyone." Lily followed him into the room, unsure of what to say. She had only just started to get to know Richard as her father, but seeing this side of him, vulnerable, reflective, made her realize just how much he was grappling with. Years of mistakes, regrets, and missed opportunities hung between them, and she could see the weight of it all pressing down on him. Richard sank into one of the large armchairs, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The once perfect picture of a wealthy, powerful businessman was now shattered, replaced by a man facing the consequences of his past choices. "I need to talk to her," Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. Lily frowned, confused. "Talk to who?" "Claire," Richard replied, his voice steadier now. "Your mother. I owe her an apology, too. More than anyone." Lily's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her mother. Claire had always been a quiet, private woman, never one to dwell on the past. But now, with Richard wanting to confront that past, Lily wasn't sure how her mother would react. Claire had kept the truth about Richard from Lily for so many years, and now everything was being unearthed. "I don't know if she'll want to see you," Lily admitted. "She's complicated." Richard nodded, understanding. "I know, but I have to try. I can't just leave things like this. I've already lost so much time." Lily wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to protect her mother from the emotional turmoil that might come with seeing Richard again. But another part of her knew that this was something they both needed. If there was any hope of moving forward, they had to confront the past. Together. "I'll talk to her," Lily finally said, her voice quiet. "I'll let her know." Richard smiled, though it was a sad smile, weighed down by years of missed connections. "Thank you," he said softly. "I appreciate that." For the next few hours, the mansion was quieter than it had ever been. The staff moved around carefully, packing Veronica's things while avoiding eye contact with Richard or Lily. Everyone knew that a storm had just passed through the house, but no one wanted to acknowledge it openly. Lily sat by the window in one of the smaller sitting rooms, watching as the sun began to set over the city. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, uncertainty, fear. She had come into this mansion just a housekeeper, and now her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Later that evening, as Lily was preparing to leave, she saw Veronica in the hallway. She was standing by the door, overseeing the last of her bags being loaded into a sleek black car. Her posture was stiff, her expression unreadable, but when her eyes met Lily's, something shifted. For a moment, the bitterness and anger that had defined Veronica seemed to fade, replaced by something else, something softer. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes was different. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't the venomous hatred Lily had come to expect either. It was resignation, a quiet acceptance that her reign over the Parker mansion had come to an end. Without a word, Veronica turned and walked out the door, the sound of the car engine starting breaking the silence. And just like that, she was gone. Lily stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Veronica was out of her life, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something painful and unresolved. That night, Lily returned home to her small apartment, her thoughts heavy with everything that had transpired. Claire was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes tired but warm as always. "How was work?" Claire asked, her voice gentle. Lily hesitated, unsure of how to bring up everything that had happened. How could she explain the truth about Richard, about Veronica, about the necklace? It all seemed too overwhelming, too complicated. But as she sat down next to her mother, she realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment to tell Claire everything. "Mom," Lily began softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Claire's brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's about Richard Parker. He's my father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. Claire's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Claire let out a long, shaky breath. "I knew this day would come," she whispered. Lily stared at her mother, confused. "You knew?" Claire nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I knew you'd find out one day. I just didn't know when." Lily felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you keep this from me for so long?" Claire wiped away a tear, her hands trembling. "I was trying to protect you," she said softly. "I didn't want you to grow up with the weight of knowing that your father had abandoned us. I thought it was better this way." Lily's heart ached at her mother's words. She understood why Claire had kept the truth hidden, but it didn't make the pain any less real. "I met him," Lily said quietly. "He wants to help us. He wants to see you." Claire's eyes widened again, and for a moment, Lily thought she might refuse. But then, slowly, Claire nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll see him." The next day, the air was thick with tension as Lily prepared for what would likely be the most emotional moment of her life. After years of silence and secrets, her mother, Claire, was finally going to meet Richard again. Lily wasn't sure how the reunion would go, but she knew it was something that needed to happen. The weight of the past had been hanging over all of them for too long. Claire was unusually quiet that morning. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring out the window as if lost in thought. Her face was pale, and her normally bright eyes seemed clouded with a mix of emotions. Lily didn't push her to talk. She knew her mother needed time to process everything. By mid-afternoon, Richard had arranged for a car to pick them up and bring them to a quiet cafe in the city, a place far from the grandeur of his mansion, a place where they could talk without the weight of status or appearances. It was neutral ground, and that felt important for what was to come. As the car pulled up in front of their apartment, Lily glanced at her mother, who had been silent for most of the ride. "Are you ready?" she asked gently, not wanting to push but knowing they couldn't turn back now. Claire took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she nodded. "I think so," she whispered, though Lily could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The cafe was small and cozy, tucked away on a quiet street lined with trees. When they arrived, Richard was already seated at a corner table, his face lined with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He stood up as soon as he saw them, his eyes locking onto Claire's. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Richard and Claire stared at each other, two people with a lifetime of history between them. Two people who had once shared something deep and meaningful, but had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Claire took a hesitant step forward, her face unreadable. Richard mirrored her, his expression softening with every step. Lily watched from the side, her heart pounding as she held her breath. She had no idea what either of them would say, or if they would say anything at all. Finally, they were standing in front of each other. Richard's eyes were filled with regret, and Claire's with years of unspoken pain. "Claire," Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Claire looked at him, her eyes flickering with a mixture of hurt and nostalgia. For a moment, Lily thought she might turn and leave, but then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Claire responded, "Richard." The single word seemed to carry the weight of years, years of longing, of heartache, of missed opportunities. They stood there, staring at each other as if trying to reconcile the past with the present, as if searching for the right words to bridge the gap that had grown between them. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never knew. I didn't know about Lily. If I had known..." Claire held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't," she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "Don't say you would have done things differently. We both know that's not how it works." Richard's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded, accepting her words. "You're right," he admitted. "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right, Claire. For you. For Lily." Claire's eyes softened slightly as she looked over at Lily, who stood watching them from a few feet away. "I kept the truth from her because I thought I was protecting her," Claire said quietly, her gaze returning to Richard. "But maybe I was wrong." Richard shook his head. "You did what you thought was best. I can't fault you for that. But now, we have a chance to do something different, to be there for her, together." Lily's heart swelled at his words, though she still felt the tension between them. This wasn't going to be easy, and she knew that it would take time for the wounds of the past to heal. But for the first time in her life, she saw the possibility of a future where they could all move forward, together. Claire hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking between Richard and Lily. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted softly. "It's been so long, and there's so much that's been left unsaid." Richard reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "One step at a time. For Lily." Claire looked down at their hands, her eyes welling with tears she had clearly been trying to hold back. For a moment, she seemed to be lost in thought, as if weighing the years of heartache against the possibility of a new beginning. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, "one step at a time." Richard smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a sign that things, while not perfect, could be better, that they could start to heal the wounds that had been left open for too long. They all sat down at the table, the initial tension between Richard and Claire giving way to a quiet, reflective conversation. They talked about the past, about the decisions that had led them to this moment. Richard apologized repeatedly, though Claire insisted that they couldn't dwell on what was already done. Lily watched them both, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The past could never be undone, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could find some peace in the present. As they finished their coffee, Richard turned to Lily, his expression serious. "I want to be a part of your life," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know I've missed so much, but if you'll let me, I want to help you. And your mother." Lily looked at her mother, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. It was a lot to take in. Richard's sudden presence in her life, the offer of help, the possibility of a relationship with the father she had never known. But as she sat there, surrounded by both of her parents for the first time in her life, something inside her began to shift. "I'd like that," Lily said softly, her heart full of emotions she was only beginning to understand. "I'd like that a lot." Richard smiled again, this time with more warmth, and Claire reached out to squeeze Lily's hand. For the first time in years, Lily felt a sense of hope. It wasn't a perfect reunion, and there were still many challenges ahead, but it was a start, and that was enough. The days following the reunion at the cafe were a whirlwind of emotions for Lily. Her relationship with Richard was still new, still fragile, but it was beginning to take shape in ways she hadn't expected. After years of working under his roof without truly knowing him, she now found herself trying to understand him as her father, a man who had missed so many years of her life, but who now wanted to be present. Richard, true to his word, made an effort to visit Lily and Claire regularly. It was awkward at first. The three of them weren't used to spending time together, and the weight of the past still hung over every conversation. But with each visit, the tension began to ease. They found small things to talk about: Lily's childhood, Claire's memories of their time together, Richard's experiences as a businessman. The conversations were light, but they were slowly building a foundation of trust. One evening, Richard arrived at their apartment with a sense of nervous anticipation. He had called ahead, asking if he could speak with both Lily and Claire together, and Lily could tell from the tone of his voice that this conversation was different from their usual visits. He was standing at the door, dressed more casually than usual, holding a box in his hands. Lily opened the door, letting him in. "Hey, Dad," she said, the words still feeling new and a little strange on her tongue, but it was getting easier to say. Richard smiled, the warmth in his expression evident. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm glad you're both here." Claire was sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, watching Richard closely. She was still getting used to having him around again, and though the bitterness of the past had softened, there were still moments when she looked at him with a quiet sadness, as if mourning the years they had lost. Richard walked over to the small dining table and placed the box down gently. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "About how I want to be a better father, a better man, for both of you. And I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right." Lily and Claire exchanged a glance, unsure of what Richard was leading up to. He took a deep breath and continued. "I want to help you both in any way I can. And I know that one of the biggest challenges has been the financial burden, especially with Claire's medical bills. So I've taken care of those." Lily's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" Richard opened the box, revealing a stack of papers. "These are all the outstanding bills for your mother's treatment. I've paid them in full." Claire gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Richard, I don't know what to say." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at Claire. "You don't have to say anything. This is the least I can do." I should have been there from the beginning, but since I wasn't, I want to do everything I can now." Lily was stunned. The weight of her mother's illness and the crushing medical bills had been hanging over them for years. It was the reason she had worked so tirelessly at the Parker mansion, always fearing that she wouldn't be able to keep up with the costs. And now, with one gesture, Richard had lifted that burden off her shoulders. "Thank you," Lily said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Richard reached out and took her hand. "I'm just sorry it took me so long to get here. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Claire, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Richard, I never wanted you to feel obligated. I kept Lily from you because I didn't want to complicate your life. But seeing you here, doing all of this for us, I realize now that I made a mistake. I should have told you from the beginning." Richard shook his head, his expression full of regret. "No, Claire. You did what you thought was right at the time. I can't blame you for that. But now, we have a chance to make things better. For all of us." There was a long pause, the three of them sitting in the quiet of the small apartment, the weight of years of unspoken truths hanging in the air. It wasn't easy to navigate this new relationship, but the desire to move forward was stronger than the pain of the past. Lily looked at her mother and then at Richard. "We've all made mistakes," she said softly. "But I think we're ready to start over, to be a family, in whatever way that works for us." Richard's eyes glistened with emotion as he nodded. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that a lot." For the rest of the evening, they sat together talking about the future. Richard shared his plans for how he wanted to be more involved in Lily's life, how he wanted to help her pursue her dreams, whatever they might be. Claire, for the first time in years, seemed lighter, as if the burden of the past had finally been lifted from her shoulders. As the night wore on, Lily felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't perfect. There were still many unresolved emotions, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a family. A real family. Before Richard left, he stood by the door, looking at both Lily and Claire with a mixture of gratitude and hope. "I'm here whenever you need me," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere this time." Lily smiled, her heart full. "We know," she said softly. "We know." As the door closed behind him, Lily and Claire sat in the quiet of their apartment, both of them reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. It wasn't the life Lily had expected, but it was a life filled with possibility, with hope. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that things would get better. In the weeks that followed, the sense of change in Lily's life became undeniable. What had once been a daily struggle to keep her head above water was now a tentative journey toward something new, something better. With Richard's support, the burden of her mother's medical bills was no longer a constant weight on her shoulders. The future, for the first time in years, felt less like an impossible climb and more like a path she could actually walk. Richard had kept true to his word. He visited frequently, spending time with both Lily and Claire, though his relationship with Claire remained complicated. The years of separation couldn't be erased in a few short weeks, but they were slowly learning how to be in each other's lives again. There were still unspoken words between them, wounds that would take time to heal, but both of them were trying. And that was enough for now. Lily, on the other hand, found herself adjusting to the idea of having a father, a real father, who cared about her. Richard had become a steady presence in her life, someone she could rely on, not just for financial help, but for emotional support as well. He had made it clear that he didn't want to overstep, that he was willing to move at her pace, and Lily appreciated that. After so many years of not knowing him, she needed time to figure out how they fit into each other's lives. One sunny afternoon, Richard invited Lily and Claire to his mansion for a small gathering. It was a quiet event, just the three of them, meant to mark a new chapter in their relationship. The mansion, once a place where Lily had felt invisible and out of place, now seemed different. She no longer walked through the grand halls as a housekeeper, but as someone who belonged. As they sat in the bright, sunlit dining room, Richard raised a glass to toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "For all of us." Lily and Claire exchanged a glance before raising their glasses as well. "To new beginnings," they echoed, clinking their glasses together.